Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Magnus Lofstrom. I am Policy Director of Criminal Justice and Senior Fellow here at PPIC. I want to welcome you to our virtual program today featuring the findings from our latest report, Crime After Proposition 47 and the Pandemic. The report, technical appendices, policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found on the website at ppic.org. The research and today's events are supported with funding from PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. We'd like to thank them for their support. And for today's programs, we're going to begin with me presenting some of the key findings from the report, and then I'm going to try to answer questions from our virtual audience. And if you have any questions, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And as a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. So with that, I'm going to start our presentation. And I want to begin by pointing out that this is joint work with Brandon Martin, who's going to join us here shortly. And we are close to a decade now since voters passed Proposition 47, and it continues to be at the center of criminal justice policy discussions. I think it's worthwhile to remind ourselves of the context in which it passed. It was part of California's efforts to reduce incarceration as a result of a 2009 federal court order to address overcrowding in its state prisons. And in spite of numerous efforts to bring down the prison population, including realignment in 2011, which significantly shifted correctional responsibility from the state to the counties, before Prop 47 passed in 2014, the state was still above the mandated prison population target. So Prop 47, it reclassified a number of drug and property offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. And it also created a misdemeanor category for shoplifting. And these are for incidents where the value of the stolen merchandise is $950 and below. As intended, it reduced incarceration and it brought down the state prison population for the first time since that federal court order below the mandated target. And it also reduced enforcement of property and drug offenses. Importantly, the pandemic-related criminal justice responses, all aimed at preventing the spread of the COVID virus, led to even more decreases in incarceration and enforcement. And these were mostly of greater magnitude, as we will see here shortly, than those of Prop 47. So what we're doing here, we're building on now a decade-long, more than a decade-long history of evaluating and examining criminal justice reforms in California, including Prop 47 and possible impacts on crime. But we have a very specific research question that we're trying to answer here, and that is, did the decreases in incarceration and enforcement as a result of Prop 47, and then later as a result of the pandemic-related criminal justice responses, did they affect crime rates? So with that, I want to start by defining what kind of crimes we are examining here. So we're using the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting categorization. So for violent crime, means that we are including homicide, rape, and robbery. That's theft without the use of force or threat of force, as well as aggravated assault. For property crime, that includes motor vehicle theft, larceny, which is theft without the use or threat of force, and burglary. And then we can break down larceny and burglary further. So for larceny, for example, it includes car break-ins, theft of car accessories, that includes catalytic converters, as well as shoplifting. For burglary, we can separate out residential and commercial burglaries. And this is important, especially given that shoplifting was defined by Prop 47 in the penal code as a misdemeanor, limited to those incidents where the value of property of the stolen property is $950 or less. For those higher value incidents, prosecutors can charge that as a second-degree burglary, something that will be included then in the commercial burglary category. We have a number of sources that we use to determine the incarceration and enforcement. So starting with incarceration, we have data on county jails and state prisons that we can bring down to the county level. And for the state prisons, this means that we're talking about the commitment county. For enforcement, we analyze impacts of changes in drug arrest rates, and those can be broken down by misdemeanors and felonies. And importantly, for the work that we're doing here, we're also looking at clearance rates. And clearance rates are the share of crimes that lead to arrest and referral to prosecution. We can think of that as crime solved, but importantly, it's also a measure of the likelihood of apprehension. So what do we see in terms of changes in incarceration and enforcement? So I'm going to start here with incarceration. And what I'm showing you are the monthly prison population and jail population in California going back to January 2010. And what we see is with the first big reform that California passed, trying to deal with the federal court order, which was realignment in 2011. And those shifts in correctional responsibilities from the state to the counties had a big impact on the prison population. It dropped by about 27,000 in the first year, but it also pushed up the jail population during that period of time by about 10 or 11,000. Both of these populations were relatively stable. We saw some uptick actually in the prison population prior to Prop 47 passed. But with Prop 47, the prison population dropped by about 7,000 in the first 2 years, and the jail population decreased by about 6,000 in those first 2 years. Again, we see relatively flat, no big changes, some fluctuation until the pandemic in early 2022. And then we see very notable drops in both the prison and the jail population. 2 years later, the prison population was down by about 30,000 compared to the pre-pandemic period. And the jail population was down by about 15,000. So turning to enforcement, starting off with arrest, what we do see here is very notable and immediate changes to arrests in the wake of Prop 47 and the pandemic. So not surprisingly, with Prop 47 and the reclassification, it reduced felony arrests for drug and property offenses. And this was only partly offset by increases in misdemeanor arrests. So we see that arrests for drug offenses, it dropped by about 10%, and those for property offenses overall dropped by about 11%. With the pandemic, we see even bigger decreases and in both felony and misdemeanor arrests. So drug and property arrests were down by 36 and 22% respectively between the end of 2019 to the end of 2022. Turning to the clearance rate, or the measure of the likelihood of apprehension, I'm showing you here the property crimes clearance rates and the violent crimes clearance rates. So starting with the property crimes clearance rate in orange, we see that it stayed pretty stable from 2000 up until 2014, fluctuated between 12 and 14%. And then we see a notable and sharp drop in 2015. And from 2014 to 2017, it dropped from about 14% to 11%. Stayed relatively flat in the next few years. And then with the pandemic, once again, we see big decrease, and it decreases all the way down to 7% by 2022. Violent crime clearance rates are significantly higher, over 40%, stayed pretty stable. We don't see any evidence of decreases in the wake of Prop 47. and no immediate decrease when the pandemic started in 2020, but we do see a decrease in 2021 and it stayed lower in 2022. And importantly, for the research that we're doing here, these changes in incarceration and enforcement, they varied notably across counties in California, both after Prop 47 and the pandemic. So we used those responses and impacts to determine then whether there were any impacts on crime rates. And before we get to our estimates of what those impacts are, I want to start by giving you a high-level and broad overview what California's crime rates look like. So I'm going to start with the violent crime rate here. And if you focus on the solid lines here, first of all, California is the orange line. And then in light green, you see what the violent crime rate was for the rest of the nation, so excluding California. And then we also have a black line that we are labeling the comparison states. The comparison states represent what the violent crime rates were in those states, a combination of states that had very similar violent crime rate trends to California before we started to embark on our criminal justice reforms with realignment in 2011. And when we look at that, we see, first of all, that California's violent crime rate trend prior to realignment was actually going down faster than that of the nation without California. It matches up with the comparison states that we've identified here. And then it appears to be a deviation, both from the comparison states as well as the nation in 2015. But this, we urge great caution against interpreting it as an increase in violent crime that stands out in California. And the reason for that is that LA Times reporters in 2014 found that one of the largest law enforcement agencies in California, LAPD, had significantly underreported aggravated assaults. And this is something that was then corrected in 2015 and later years, meaning that when we look at those 2015 numbers, a big part of that increase that we're seeing represents just a correction of LAPD violent crimes data. So if we instead take LAPD out of this, we see that California's crime rate does not appear to deviate from neither the nationwide trends nor that of the comparison states until the pandemic, when we're seeing an increase that is not seen in the comparison states or nationwide. Turning to property crime, again, same idea here. Comparison states are those in black. Now we're matching it up on the property crime rate, and we see that we can identify a combination of states that had very similar property crime rates to California leading up to realignment. And then in 2012, we see a jump, and this is driven by auto theft. We see that California's property crime rate trend it parallels then in the next few years those of comparison states and the nation. And then we see another jump in 2015, the year after Prop 47 was passed. This is primarily driven by an increase in larceny, but also to some extent an increase in auto theft. And then for a number of years, again, we see that California's crime rate, property crime rate, parallels that of nation without California, as well as the comparison state. And then in 2022, we see another increase that stands out a bit against the comparison states as well as the US. Here now, it's driven by commercial burglaries, and we also saw a slightly greater increase in auto thefts in California. So what we want to do next is we want to see to what extent, if any, did the decreases in incarceration and enforcement contribute to these trends? So what I'm showing you here are what our estimates are for Prop 47. So I'm going to start off with Prop 47. And in orange, you see what our estimated impacts are of the decreases in incarceration as a result of Prop 47 on crimes. And the arrows that you see represent here a 95% confidence interval. meaning that if that arrow does not cross that zero line, we deem that a statistically significant impact. And so if we begin by looking at what the impact of the decreases in the prison incarceration rate was, we see that it led to an increase in property crime by a little bit over 2%. And then we see that that's primarily driven by auto thefts. If we look at the larceny clearance rate, and larceny clearance rate was the biggest contributor to the decreases in the clearance rates that California experienced in the wake of Prop 47. And here we see a broader impact that includes burglary, larceny, and auto thefts, ranging between 1% and 3%. As I mentioned before, we can break down burglary and larceny to more specific crimes and examine whether there were any particular impacts on that. So here, again, in orange, we have the impact of incarceration. What we see is that the decrease in the jail incarceration rate pushed up car break-ins by about 3.7%. For the larceny clearance rate, we see evidence also of an increase in car break-ins of about 2%. And then we're also seeing some evidence of increases in residential burglary as well as commercial burglary. Turning to the pandemic and possible impacts of the pandemic-induced changes in incarceration and enforcement. And starting with incarceration, we see that the decrease in the jail population pushed up burglaries by about 1.5%. That's entirely driven by an increase in commercial burglaries of a little bit over 2%. Larceny clearance rates pushed up the larceny crime rate, and that was driven by an increase in car break-ins, as well as theft of car accessories, including catalytic converters. We're also finding evidence that the burglary clearance rates pushed up burglaries by 1.3%, and this is entirely driven by an increase of commercial burglaries of about 3%. So to summarize what we find here, so we find that these decreases in incarceration and enforcement as a result of Prop 47 and then later by the pandemic-related criminal justice responses had led to modest increases in crime and appears to be limited to property crime. So we break down what the specific impacts were of incarceration and enforcement. Starting with incarceration, we find that Prop 47 led to increases in auto thefts as well as car break-ins. Pandemic also pushed up auto thefts as well as commercial burglaries. And the lower clearance rates as a result of Prop 47, we find that it increased burglaries, auto theft, as well as larcenies, while the pandemic decreases in the lower clearance rate led to increases in car accessory thefts, car break-ins, and commercial burglaries. So while all of these impacts that I'm sharing with you here are statistically significant, it's important to point out, well, they only represent a small fraction of the total increases in the types of crimes that we're talking about here that we saw in California over the periods that we're examining here. And also we find stronger evidence of an impact of the pandemic and the pandemic-related criminal justice responses to enforcement and incarceration on retail theft than we do of Prop 47. And we don't find any evidence of increases in crime driven by the significant decreases in drug arrests. So turning to policy implications and starting with incarceration. So what we find here is that we've reduced our prison and our jail populations notably. It's more than 60,000 decrease in the combined jail and the prison population from Prop 47 as well as the pandemic. And we find that they led to a modest rise in some property crime. So this is more than 60,000 decrease in the prison and jail population. That comes after realignment decreased our incarcerated population by roughly about 17, 18%. And those increases that led to increases in the decreases in these incarcerated population led to increases in property crime of similar magnitudes to realignment. So we do find, I think it's important to point out, we do find evidence of increases from these efforts in terms of property crime, but it's also encouraging. It shows that in spite of these big changes, it didn't have big impacts. It didn't lead to significantly large impacts, broad impacts on crime, and points towards continued limited crime preventive effects of incarceration. There's one caveat. We do find some weak, not statistically significant evidence of a small effect on violent crime. So put all this together, it suggests that we should consider evidence-based alternatives to jails and prisons. Turning to enforcement and policy implications around that, as I mentioned and showed you, property crime clearance rate dropped dramatically between 2014 and 2022 from 14 to 7%, meaning that a person is about half as likely to be apprehended for property crime in 2022 compared to 2014. We do see that the decrease in the clearance rate led to increases in some property crime, including retail theft. One of the things that we found that you might have seen in one of the figures that I showed, it was pointing towards that the decrease in the larceny clearance rate appeared to have pushed down shoplifting in the wake of Prop 47. This could have been because retailers are reporting fewer of the actual theft incidents that they're experienced, but it's also possible that it represents a shift in how these retail theft incidents are being reported, from being reported as shoplifting to commercial burglaries. Now, fortunately, our data does not allow for separation of those impacts. So importantly, what we need to do here is determine what are the contributing factors to the decrease in the clearance rates, and then also reverse those falling rates. So one of the possible contributing factors here is the decrease in law enforcement officers that we've experienced in California. Going back to the Great Recession, we've seen decreases, and by 2022, we had the lowest patrol officer rate in California since 1991, which is as far back as we can go with those data. And the importance of reversing the falling rates, well, we can see that from looking at the robust literature that points out there's a higher likelihood of being apprehended for a crime is more effective in deterring crime than harsher penalties or longer sentences. All right, so with that, I want to remind you to submit questions to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. And now what I want to do is I want to move on to audience questions, and I want to invite my colleague and co-author for this report, Research Associate Brandon Martin. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you, Magnus. So our first question, it comes from Bethany Renfrey, who's the Legislative Director for Senator Durazo. And her question is, it seems like Prop 47 is generating and investing millions of dollars into community-based programs each year. Do you have a sense of how these investments in local communities have contributed to reducing the prison population? So Magnus, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the savings, and then if you have anything to chime in on the question, that'd be great.
Perfect.
So as we mentioned in the report and briefly in the presentation, Proposition 47 did require that any state savings that comes from the measure be used for grant programs. And so 3 state agencies receive funding from the savings to run grant programs. 65% of the savings goes to the Board of State and Community Corrections, and they provide grants to local agencies for programs to provide mental health services, substance use disorder treatment, and diversion programs for individuals involved within the criminal justice system. An additional 25% of the savings goes to the California Department of Education. And the California Department of Education provides grants to local education agencies to help at-risk students stay in school. So specifically, they're trying to target chronic absenteeism, out-of-school suspensions, and also student dropouts. The final 10% of savings goes to the California Victims Compensation Board, and they provide grants to trauma recovery centers that provide trauma-informed, evidence-based services to victims of crimes. And so Bethany is correct that there's been about to date over 800 million worth of savings from the measure. I do want to note that because of the differing time periods of the grants and how the grants are given out, not all 800 million has been spent to date, but that's what the savings has been to date. I do also just want to say, for those interested in seeing like who the actual grantees are, our technical appendix in Technical Appendix C provides detailed information on the actual grantees. And then also the Board of State and Community Corrections has a very good website for Prop 47, looking at the actual grant programs, what they're doing, and then also their final evaluations. It's to Bethany's question, it's hard to tell exactly who in these programs might now not be going to prison. A lot of these programs vary in their size and also what they're doing. And so it's just sort of hard to tell exactly what the outcomes of at least the BSCC programs for those involved in the criminal justice system have been on the prison population. Magnus, do you want to add anything to Bethany's question?
No, I think the only thing that I want to point out that I think is worthwhile is that with all of those efforts and different kind of programs that have been implemented here, it really presents an opportunity to do an evaluation, try to identify what works and what doesn't work. And so that is something that we're also urging in our report, that more efforts towards evaluation that can identify the effective approaches to these issues would be really beneficial as well. So that's about the only thing that I'd want to add.
Thanks, Magnus. Yeah, I also just want to reiterate that the BSCC's website does have both the evaluation plans for each grantee and then also their final evaluations for the grant programs that have closed. So for those interested in specific outcomes, I would direct you there. You know, each evaluator is different, and how they went about evaluating is different as well. But moving on to our next question. It's from a viewer in Sacramento. They asked, the figure on slide 11 shows that shoplifting went down after Proposition 47. That doesn't seem to make sense. Can you explain further?
Yeah, that's a good observation there, and I was alluding to it a little bit here at the very end. Yeah, so what it does indicate is that in the wake of Prop 47, as I showed you, the property crime clearance rate dropped. Especially the larceny clearance rate dropped very notably. And what it suggests is that as the larceny clearance rate is coming down, that shoplifting would go down as a result as well. And that's right, that's counterintuitive. So what might be behind that? I don't think we can give you a definitive answer to that, because there are two possible impacts here. One is that as there are less that the law enforcement responses to these reported incidences are going down, so there are less consequences in that sense, it might lead some retailers to not report all of those incidents. So it might increase the underreporting of some incidents. So that's one possible contributing factor that would explain those results. The other part is the fact that Prop 47 created a shoplifting category that is limited to misdemeanors. So those are the incidents where the value of the stolen merchandise is $950 and less. And for all of those incidents where it's of greater value, that can be charged as a second-degree burglary, a felony, it's possible that it reflects a shift in the reporting, and those higher value incidents are increasingly being reported as second-degree burglary in the commercial burglary sector, and that would then represent part of the decrease. So that's a complication. We don't know exactly what is behind that, but either of those possibilities are plausible.
Thank you, Magnus. Our third question comes from a viewer in the SF Bay area. Their question is, you mentioned a decrease in law enforcement officers. Do you have any explanation for the drop in officers in California?
That's a great question. So I think it's difficult to say. First, it's not a new phenomenon. We see this going back to around 2008. So now we're looking at the Great Recession with a very challenging fiscal environment, budget challenges for municipalities as well as counties. So that might have contributed to some decreases in the number of law enforcement officers. Fast forward to 21, 22, over those 2 years combined, we see a decrease of about 3,600 law enforcement officers in California. It's hard to say exactly what's behind that, but it's widely reported, and you can see it as well, that there are challenges that law enforcement agencies are facing in terms of both recruitment and retention as well. And what's behind that is difficult to say exactly, but that's a more recent one, and you might have a different explanation for the recent decrease compared to the one that we saw maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you, Magnus. Our next question comes from a viewer in the Central Valley. In the report, when looking at it and comparing crime rates to other states, you don't include 2021 data because of low reporting. Do you know what caused the low reporting?
Yeah, so this is important. In 2021, FBI implemented a change in its reporting system. It went from the traditional uniform crime reporting system to something that's called a national incident-based reporting system. And there are a lot of advantages of this new system that's called NIBRS. It includes much more detailed information about the crimes. It includes information about whether an arrest was happened, and details around the person who was arrested. It has information about the location. It has information not only about the most serious offense that was reported, which is the case for the UCR. And what it meant is that this led to complications and challenges for law enforcement agencies to implement this new system. And there's been a number of law enforcement agencies that have not been able to do so. And so that's a big part of the fewer agencies that reported in 2021. It went up in 2022, the number of agencies, and then we see further increases in 2023, it appears. So I think those are the main reasons.
Great, thanks, Magnus. Our next two questions come from Arlo. I'm going to break them up because they're a bit different. Their first question is, could you talk a bit more about how this analysis looks at a county level? I'm interested in Alameda County in particular.
Well, so we are looking at these county level changes that happen as a result of Prop 47, as well as the pandemic-related criminal justice responses. Both of these led to decreases in incarceration and enforcement. And what I pointed out was that, yes, that is correct. These changes did not play out the same in counties for various reasons. So we are using those differences across the counties, and they changed over time since they were implemented. And those are the things that we use to identify the effects. It's difficult to say, for example, exactly what happened in Alameda and how it played out there. But it is important to point out, again, in our technical appendices, we have information about how the jail population changed in Alameda County over these two periods of times, prison population, and the same thing for our measures of enforcement as well. So you can see those, but it's difficult to pinpoint any particular county. It's something that we haven't done in this report, at least.
Thanks, Magnus. Their next question is, you mentioned that swift and certain consequences are more important than harsh sentences for deterrence. But do we have a sense of what registers as a consequence? Many people arrested for property crimes don't spend more than a few hours in jail. Can we expect such a short detention period to have a deterrent effect?
Well, I think so. What I was referring to here is essentially what is found in the literature to have a big deterrent effect on crime. Is it the likelihood of being caught? That is, are you going to face any consequences at all? Or is it going to be the severity of those consequences? And what that research finds is it is that the likelihood of apprehension has the stronger deterrent effect than the length of those consequences. And to what extent it's 1 day, 3 days, or the length of what those consequences are, that's more difficult to answer. But what I'm talking about here is the likelihood of apprehension versus that severity of what those consequences might be.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you, Arlo, for the questions. Our next question comes from Margot. She's the co-chair of the California Public Defenders Association Legislative Committee. The question is there a correlation between the decrease in staffing, self-checkout, et cetera, at retail stores and the rate of shoplifting?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, this is one of the things that we can't shed light on because of data limitations. We don't know exactly where those changes in staffing at retail establishments are being implemented. And we don't have the geographic specificity to, even if we had those data, to identify or examine whether there is a relationship between those.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you, Margot, for the question. Our final question from the audience is, how does the drop in incarceration in California compare to other states in the nation?
Well, that's another good question. Well, if we go back to early 2000, say we look at 2000, for example, what we see is that in 2000, California actually had a higher incarceration rate than the rest of the nation. It was about 7% higher. And then with the various criminal justice reforms that we have passed and other efforts to reduce incarceration, and then the pandemic related criminal justice responses that led to further decreases, we have decreased our incarcerated population more than in the rest of the country. So in 2022, which is the last year we have data from across the nation, California's incarceration rate was 23% lower. So that's from 7% higher to 23% lower. So yes, we certainly decreased our incarcerated population more than we see in the rest of the country.
Thank you, Magnus. We want to thank everyone for their questions. Seeing that there are no more audience questions, we've reached the end of today's program. First, thank you, Magnus, for the presentation and discussion. Second, I would like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of today's program. And thanks all of you for joining us online. We'd appreciate you taking a moment to give us your feedback on today's presentation. If you pre-registered for this event, you will receive an email with a link to a short survey, but you can also scan the QR code on your screen right now. Finally, a recording of today's event will be available in the coming days on the PPIC website and our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. Finally, thank you and have a great afternoon.